I've been asked to look at the Rover L Series engine. Rover is a UK brand. They're not that popular. Rover actually stopped manufacturing cars. So we're going to delve into the history of this engine. It really teaches us how to tune and modify an older diesel engine. So some of the obstacles that we're going to have on the L Series engine is the ECU is next to impossible to map through the OBD2 port. The fuel system is rather clunky and old. It doesn't use a modern common rail fuel system. And in fact, many of the features on the engine are considered rather basic by today's electronic standards. There's a lot of mechanical systems within the engine to just govern the way the fuel is actually burnt and the engine delivers the power. So just looking at an older diesel engine like the L Series can just help us to build up a portfolio of strategies to extracting more power from these older diesel engines. But the L Series certainly is a very interesting piece of motoring history. So we'll just delve into this engine and discuss the best ways of getting power from it. So the L Series engine was first born on the 28th of November 1994. This engine was a significant milestone for Rover because it started to use the Bosch fuel injection system. The power output of the L Series ranged, there was a few different versions which we're going to discuss in just a moment, but power ranged from about 84 horsepower to 114 horsepower. And certainly with mods you can make a very, very interesting hike in the power delivered on those engines. So the original MG Rover company that produced this engine no longer exists. So that can make sourcing replacement parts and upgrades very hard. Unlocking the ECU and getting in there yourself can be very, very difficult because the knowledge really has just disappeared. So we're going to look at some strategies of extracting more power from these engines, even though the manufacturer no longer exists and it is very challenging to buy parts for these older engines. I actually had a Rover 200 way back in the 2000s. I loved that car. It was really good fun. It's really sort of based heavily on the Honda Integra. It was a sort of UK Integra. I had the 220 GTI version. There was a 2-litre turbo version as well. So they're very interesting cars to drive. Reliability wise, mine wasn't fantastic, but that was really what caused me to start TorqueCars in the first place, to document my experiences of modifying my first car all those years ago. And I think it's fair to say a lot has happened in the last 20 odd years. I've certainly not been playing with Rovers for quite some time now. So if you're aware of anything I've missed or have any suggestions to pass on, please do that in the comments. I really want the comments on this video to be useful to anyone with these older L Series Rover engines, or indeed anyone with an older diesel engine that are looking for upgrades and mods that can be fairly easy to source and make a significant difference to the power. So the Rover 600 was really the model that the L Series was destined for. It originally started production in the Longbridge plant, and later as volume increased, production was moved to the Solihull plant, and it was used in far more than just the Rover 600. In fact, it was used by Austin in the Montego and the Maestro, and it was also used in the popular Sherpa van. So this L Series engine had a wide range of applications. Unfortunately, Rover went out of business effectively just as they were starting to explore developing a common rail engine. This was a pre-runner to the G Series engine that was later developed, that was a 16-valve engine which boasted common rail fuel injection. And you can really see how the engine has evolved from the L Series into that G Series. So there were 3 primary versions of the L Series engine. The first one didn't have an intercooler. It was very, very basic. The fuel injection system was mechanically controlled, and they had a unique intake manifold, certainly unique compared to the other versions. The turbo that was used was the GT1549, which provided a decent amount of boost. The turbo itself was a good size. It spooled up nicely on the L Series engine. So it felt to a lot of drivers that this turbo was custom built and designed for the L Series engine. It just delivered power really, really smoothly, and it really made the engine a sheer delight to drive. As the L Series engine evolved into a second version, we start to see an intercooler being used. Obviously, if you've got one of the early ones without an intercooler is really one of the first mods that you should think about, because it does make a significant difference to the engine's ability to convert the oxygen in the air into power, because you'll have more of it. The intercooler will lower that intake charge after the turbo has done its thing. The fuel injection was now electronically controlled, so models that were designated as a DI were typically the ones that had this more advanced engine setup. So that was commonly on the Rover 200, the Rover 400 series and the 600. The addition of VP37 and a servo-controlled fuel pump marked a stark contrast with those early mechanical units that were used. They still used the GT1549 turbo, and this second version of the engine certainly gives you a good reward when you start tuning it. A lot of those earlier teething problems to the tuner, the performance enthusiast, have been ironed out and corrected in the design of the second version of the engine. But certainly looking at what was changed, you can source parts from these newer engines and fit them to the older engines and effectively increase the power fairly easily on those older engines. So the most recent generation of the L Series, the third significant step in its evolution, featured better intercooling, an electronically controlled VP30 pump. The DI engines, I believe, used the VP37, but this pump-driven fuel injection system was so much better than those early mechanical systems that we used. Power output was technically about the same, but the torque output was significantly higher. So these cars were much better for driving if you wanted to tow a caravan or do some serious towing or long distance driving. This really is the version of the engine that people would go for. This was used in the more recent Rover 25, the 45, the MG-ZR and the MG-ZS. The turbo was often referred to as a GT1549S. There were some further improvements made to the compressor wheel side of the turbo. The Allied Signal badged turbo is still essentially a GT15, and it provides enough boost to support power levels fairly easily of about 100 horsepower to 150 horsepower. So there's a lot of flexibility there on the turbos that they were using. So engine blocks were very, very similar across the range. There was a little bit of an exception. The Land Rover Freelander SDI had quite a few different design elements to the conventional L Series that was used in the regular cars. So a lot of people don't really regard that as a straight swap replacement. Even the parts on that, it can sometimes be a challenge when you've sourced these Freelander parts to get them working on the basic L Series engine. That engine had a two-stage fuel injection, and the ECU really was extensively controlling both the fuel and the timing of delivery to just optimize the power and the torque output. So actually you can see the roots of the more recent Land Rover TD5 engine in this early L Series engine. They used a similar bore and stroke. The pistons, connecting rods, crankshaft and other internal engine component dimensions were all very, very similar. The TD5 engine that was used by Land Rover used the Lucas electronic unit injection system through flow cylinder head, and a lot of the ancillary equipment was changed just better to suit the Land Rover chassis and engine bay design. So keep an eye out on the glow plug configuration for the L Series engine because there were a few variations. Some of the L Series had just 3 glow plugs, others had 4. Typically the later VP30 driven engines had 4, but I believe there are some exceptions to that. Let me know in the comments what your findings were with regard to that. So the glow plugs are not really there for performance. They just reduce the emissions while the engine is cold. They help the engine to reach its operating temperature more quickly and can really help with those cold starts on extremely cold days. So the stock intercooler that was used on the L Series engine will typically provide power to about 150 horsepower. Beyond that level, it will start to struggle from heat soak. So what does an intercooler do? Let's just discuss the merits of intercoolers and why we have intercoolers on our modern turbocharged engines. So the intercooler is basically a radiator and it takes the compressed air from the turbo and cools it down. Why does it cool it down? Well, when you compress air, it gets very, very hot. The more the air is compressed, the hotter it gets. You've probably noticed that when you pump up your car tyre, the nozzle of the pump starts to get very warm. That's the effect of the compressed air heating up. So you really want that intake charge to be as low as possible when it comes to the intake temperature. So an intercooler effectively exposes that hot compressed air to the ambient air and drops the temperature back down. So you might think that having a massive intercooler will add loads of power, but it doesn't quite work like that. The intercooler size is generally determined by the flow rate of the engine, and you can actually reduce the velocity and the flow rate significantly by going with the wrong intercooler design. Now, a larger intercooler does offer benefits over a smaller stock factory one in that it doesn't heat up as quickly. It will dispel the heat that builds up in the exhaust charge for longer periods of time. So with a lot of factory setups, the small intercooler is barely adequate. And if you're doing a lot of spirited driving, that intercooler itself is starting to get warm. And if the radiator that the hot air is going into is warm, it's not going to be as efficient at cooling it down. So upgrading the intercooler, it doesn't significantly add power. It stops you losing power. So when it comes to mapping or tuning the L Series engine, this is where you've got a challenge. Rover used the MEMS ECU, the modular engine management system. And to my knowledge, you can't map it or get into it via the OBD2 port. So what do? The ECU is effectively locked. You can't change the map in that. And there is so much hidden performance locked away inside that ECU. So how do you get that missing performance? Well, you can actually replace the chips in it that hold the map. So that obviously requires the dismantling and reassembly of that. In some cases, you can do it with connectors going directly onto the PCB on the ECU itself, but it does require specialist knowledge and skill. But it's really one of the best ways of changing the way the engine works. So if you can afford it and you've got someone that has the knowledge to set this up for you, go that route. You'll get so much more power and flexibility from your engine by doing that. It's on the MEMS ECUs, there are two 28-pin chips that contain the maps that control everything inside the engine. They're marked 27C256, I believe, so they're the ones to look out for. The smaller 93C46 chips are just 8-pin chips, and they contain the electronics connected to the immobilizer system. So if you get a new ECU, typically you'll have to swap those immobilizer coded chips to the new ECU. You can't just bung a new ECU in because the immobilizer is going to prevent the engine from starting, and you can have a whole host of headaches. So from talking to people and the experience I gained sort of having my Rover all those years ago was really to swap these chips from your old ECU into a new one, and you've got something that's programmed and ready to take everything from your car and make it work from the get-go, rather than messing around trying to bypass the immobilizer system. You can get the ECU to ignore the immobilizer circuits completely. Again, that requires a little bit of specialist knowledge, but you really do want the benefit of having the immobilizer on the car, because after you've added all this power, it's going to be much more desirable to thieves. So you really want to look after it. So if we can't get the chip replaced, we can't get a specialist to change the map inside the chip on the ECU, what other routes are there? Well, we can go with a Piggyback tuning box. So this plugs in between the MEMS unit and the various sensors and electronic systems on the car. And it basically lies. It creates a situation where the ECU is told one set of information and then it misinterprets that and sends it out to the parts, and it sends a different message out to the components in the engine. For example, it may up the fuel delivery. So that's obviously a great way of getting more power, burning more fuel, but you've got to be very careful that you don't just create more certs. So a lot of these plug-in boxes, all they do is fool the ECU into thinking there's different amounts and different temperature air getting into the engine, causing it to dump more fuel. So that's crude. It's probably one of the cheapest mods you can do, just getting a resistor and wiring it in so the ECU is working always to the wrong amount of air and wrong temperature of air coming into the engine to just dump more fuel. But that can create a lot more soot. It's a lot more clunky. The more complex plug-in boxes are microprocessor controlled and can make varying degrees of change. So your car is just not dumping significant extra amounts of fuel all the time. It's just doing it when there is a power requirement. It reduces the amount of soot that's being output by the engine as it burns. There was a Synergy Rover 1 TU1. And I also remember a company called Icon Race that were making plug-in modules for these early Rovers. I'll be curious to know if you've got an L Series engine, if you've been able to source any of these aftermarket Piggyback ECUs, and let me know what you thought of them in the comments, please. So at about 140 horsepower, you're going to start to create excessive amounts of smoke. The air intake system on the L Series engine is going to need to be adapted because you'll end up with a restriction in there. So for 150 horsepower, most people are fitting cone filters on the L Series engine. If they swap to higher flowing fuel injectors or they've been messing around with the fuel system, it's quite possible that the car is going to be quite smoky at that point. So it really pays to get a specialist involved and to get the correct injectors and get everything set up so the engine is not burning fuel unnecessarily and you're extracting as much power as you can from the fuel that's going into your L Series engine. So if you live in a country where it's legal to decat, to remove the catalyst from the exhaust on your L Series engine, that's a good mod. Most people have quoted about 5 horsepower extra by doing that. The VP30 fuel units give quite a decent amount of fuel pressure. It's around 1,400 bar. And with the stock turbo, it's fairly easy to get the power up to about 150 horsepower on these engines. At 160 horsepower, that's the point you should start thinking about upgrading the fuel pump and the injectors. Those early mechanical fuel pumps that were fitted to the non-intercooled engines will top out at much lower figures, with many struggling to hit 130 horsepower. They can be tweaked. There's a little screw on them. You need to know what you're doing, otherwise you're just going to create all sorts of problems for yourself. But they can be tweaked to provide a little bit better fuel delivery, a little bit more fuel, so you can get that little bit more power out of your engine. And the fuel tank lift pump is generally quite happy up to about 130 horsepower. But beyond that, you're starting to run into its spare capacity. If it started to age, you're going to hit all sorts of problems with fuel delivery. So if you notice flat spots at higher RPM driving, it's probably the fuel system that's letting you down on the L Series engine. So cams have been used by a few to improve the power output on the L Series engine. So camshafts, we still talk about camshafts, although they've become somewhat irrelevant on modern engines. So the camshaft has a series of lobes that directly open the valves that control the intake and the exhaust into the engine. So depending on the shape of the lobe on the camshaft, it depends on the duration that the valve is open and closed for. So with a performance camshaft, that will dramatically increase the intake and the exhaust stroke on the engine, allowing the valves maybe to be open a little bit longer, to change the overlap period, to enhance the acceleration of the engine. But if you go too aggressive, you often get a very lumpy idle and a lumpy tick over. Now, with modern engines, the need for a fast road camshaft, that's a camshaft that's got a profile set up for everyday driving, but slightly better than the manufacturer. So you'll see about 260 to 275 degrees on those camshafts. And then you get the competition cams, which is anything over about 270 degrees, 280, that sort of ballpark. Those competition cams are very, very lumpy on tick over and idle. So as this is a fairly rare engine now, you won't find off-the-shelf cams for the L Series engine, but companies like Kent and Piper will regrind the stock cam to a better profile. So most people would opt for fast road profile. It's quite an expensive mod, but it does make a significant difference if you've done other mods and the engine is tuned and set up to get the most power from that. There's actually a dirty little hack you can do on the turbo actuator. So the turbo actuator really delivers the amount of boost the turbo is supplying. So by tweaking the actuator itself, you can raise the boost to around 18 or 19 psi. That seems to be the sweet spot on the L Series engine. Looking at various guides and people that I've spoken to, around about 18, 19, 20 psi is the optimum output for those stock turbos. But it's strongly recommended that you have a boost gauge in order to just monitor what's going on. You won't know how much PSI of boost is coming when you've started manually adjusting the wastegate on the turbo. So having a boost controller will just let you fine tune and hit that sweet spot more precisely. If the boost is too high, you're going to wreck your turbo. You're going to cause all sorts of problems for yourself. So again, as with most mods, it's worth investing in someone who understands these engines and who knows what they're actually doing. So on the air intakes, we've spoken about changing to an induction kit. Now, it's worth noting that the ribbed intake hose actually causes a bit of drag, a bit of restriction. And a lot of people have quoted more power, or they felt the car is more flexible when they've switched to a smooth silicone pipe. So those ribbed pipes, they're quite nice to fit. They're very, very flexible. You can see why manufacturers have done them, but they don't do much to enhance the airflow going into the engine. So they can be a little bit of a problem. I haven't got any set figures on how much extra power you can expect just swapping the hose. But if you've done other mods, you certainly don't want to have any kind of restriction in there. You want to get the best out of the money you've invested in your L Series engine. So when you start aiming for beyond 130 horsepower, things are getting more complex. They're getting more expensive. You've probably got an older high mileage car, so you've got to question whether you want to go this extra route and get that little bit more power from it. A turbo upgrade will see you hit about 150 to 175 horsepower, providing you've got the fuel delivery sorted to cope with that. If you know of a turbo upgrade for the L Series diesel engine, please let me know in the comments. I've not been able to find any when I was just looking around researching this video, but I'm sure there are some out there, or people have adapted existing turbos to make them work well. Now, another little tip on all of these L Series engines is to just pay attention to the rough casting. The manufacturing at this time period was rather crude. The casting left lots of little marks and imperfections on the surface. So inside the turbo itself, inside the manifold and the intake, you will notice lots and lots of cast marks and little rough patches. Just smoothing these out can make a significant difference to the way the air flows into the engine. Some people talk about port matching, gasket matching. It's a diesel engine, it's an L Series. I don't personally feel there is much advantage in the extra work involved. And if you don't know what you're doing, you can completely mess up that lovely low-end torque delivery of the L Series engine. So I certainly wouldn't recommend this specialist work if you were trying to do it on a DIY basis. But if you really wanted to invest serious money in your engine to get the max out of it, it's probably worth thinking about and taking it to a specialist to get that properly flowed, ported and polished, just to maximize the top end power that you get from this engine. So I hope this has been a good overview. It's certainly interesting looking at these older turbo engines, because we can learn a lot from how manufacturers have developed, how the evolution of an engine has taken us to these stringent emissions regulation standards that we have today. Things are much better produced nowadays, much more tightly machined. The tolerances are much finer. So we have effectively better engines. They should theoretically be a lot more reliable than they were. I'll let you debate in the comments as to whether you think modern engines are better than these older engines. But I hope you found this video useful and informative. Please boot the like button. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. We would love you to stay tuned to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in this next video that I've lined up.